These suppers came from the hills, and they kept families alive. Long before grocery aisles and packaged meals, Appalachian households depended on food that could be grown, gathered, hunted, or stretched through another night. These were not novelty dishes. They were survival meals, cooked after hard labor and eaten without ceremony. Many of these suppers vanished quietly. Some were labeled poor. Others disappeared as people left the mountains and memories faded. But each dish carried a purpose. They filled empty stomachs, conserved scarce supplies, and passed down knowledge that did not exist on paper. What you are about to see is not folklore or exaggeration. These are real meals that once appeared on real tables, night after night. Forgetting them means forgetting how entire communities endured hardship with discipline and ingenuity. By the end of this video, you will understand why these hillbilly suppers mattered, why they worked, and why they still deserve a place in America's food history. Let us begin with the first forgotten supper. Soup, beans, and cornbread. Soup, beans, and cornbread were not a side dish in the Appalachian Hills. They were supper itself. After long days cutting timber, tending hogs, or working a mine, families gathered around a pot of pinto beans that had simmered since morning. The beans were soaked overnight, then cooked low and slow with salt, onion, and sometimes a scrap of fatback. Nothing fancy. The goal was fullness, not flavor experiments. Cornbread baked in a cast-iron skillet while the beans thickened, filling the cabin with a smell everyone recognized as relief. This meal mattered because it could be repeated endlessly. Pinto beans were cheap, dried well, and fed many mouths. Cornmeal came from local mills and kept through winter. Together, they formed a complete supper that asked very little from a struggling household. There was ritual in how it was eaten. Beans were ladled first, then cornbread broken by hand, never cut. Leftover pot liquor was saved, not wasted. Sometimes the next day it became breakfast, poured over cold bread before work began again. Soup, beans, and cornbread taught restraint and patience. You waited for them. You respected the time they took. In return, they gave strength without complaint. As modern meals replaced them, this supper faded from regular tables. But for generations it meant security. It meant no one went to bed hungry. This was hillbilly cooking at its core. Simple, reliable, unapologetic. And it worked. It stood as proof that survival did not require abundance. It required discipline, memory, and trust in what had always carried people through. This supper did not impress guests. It sustained families. That is why it deserves to be remembered, not as nostalgia, but as evidence of endurance shaped by necessity. Passed down quietly, generation after generation, without praise or written instruction ever recorded. Fried potatoes and onions. Fried potatoes and onions were a supper built for nights when nothing else was left. In Appalachian kitchens, a few potatoes could decide whether a family ate or waited until morning. This dish did not pretend to be more than it was. It was hot, filling, and dependable. Potatoes were peeled only when time allowed. Skins often stayed on. They were sliced thin, dropped into a heavy skillet, and cooked slowly in lard or saved bacon grease. Onions followed, added for sweetness and depth, not decoration. Salt was the only seasoning most households could spare. This meal mattered because it required almost nothing. Potatoes stored well in root cellars. Onions lasted through cold months. Grease was reused until it was gone. A single pan fed everyone, and leftovers rarely survived the night. Fried potatoes and onions were eaten straight from the skillet. Plates were optional. Cornbread or biscuits, if available, were used to scrape the pan clean. Every bite counted, and nothing was wasted. This supper carried quiet lessons. Use what you have. Do not rush heat. Pay attention. Food like this demanded presence, not skill. Anyone could cook it, and everyone relied on it. As food became cheaper and faster, this dish lost its place. It was called plain. It was called boring. But it once meant relief at the end of exhausting days. Fried potatoes and onions deserve remembrance because they fed families through uncertainty. They asked for patience, not money. They offered warmth when options were limited. This was not a side dish. It was survival in a skillet, repeated countless nights, trusted without question, and remembered long after the pan went cold. Ramps and eggs. Ramps and eggs marked the return of food after winter scarcity. When snow pulled back from Appalachian hillsides, families searched the woods for wild ramps, a sharp-smelling onion that grew where little else would. Ramps mattered because they were free. They required no garden space, no seed money, and no waiting. Once found, they were cleaned, chopped, and dropped into a hot skillet with fat saved since fall. Eggs followed, usually from hens just beginning to lay again. This supper was quick, but its meaning was deep. It signaled that hunger would loosen its grip. Fresh green food meant strength returning to bodies worn down by winter meals of beans and cornmeal. Ramps and eggs were not eaten politely. The smell filled the house and lingered on clothes. Children learned early that this was hill food, not town food. You ate it because it worked, not because it impressed anyone. This meal also carried risk. Overharvesting could empty a hillside for years. Knowledge of when to dig, how much to take, and where to return was passed quietly, without instruction. As roads expanded and store food replaced foraging, ramps and eggs faded from daily life. The dish survived mostly as novelty, stripped of its purpose. Remembering it matters. Ramps and eggs represent timing, restraint, and connection to land. It was a supper that reminded people they belonged to the mountains, and that survival often came from paying attention, not buying more. It taught seasons, limits, and respect for place, lessons learned without classrooms, written rules, or permission, carried forward by repetition, memory, and need, until those lessons became instinct, shaping how people cooked, gathered, shared, and endured long before abundance arrived in the hills where survival always came first for generations without apology there. Cornmeal mush and milk. Cornmeal mush and milk were a supper built for endurance. When money vanished, this simple bowl carried families through cold nights. It asked for time, not skill. Cornmeal was stirred slowly into boiling water, thickened over steady heat, and left to set. No seasoning was required. The mush was sliced, reheated, or eaten warm, depending on the night. Milk was poured over the top, fresh when possible, watered down when not. This supper mattered because it stretched. A small amount of cornmeal fed many. Milk added fat and comfort, even when portions were thin. In lean households, this meal appeared morning and night, sometimes sweetened with a spoon of sorghum, sometimes eaten plain. Cornmeal mush taught patience. You could not rush it without ruining it. Children learned to stir without stopping, to wait for thickening, to accept what the pot gave. Waste was not an option. Leftovers were sliced and fried the next day, nothing thrown away. As packaged cereals arrived, this supper disappeared. It was called old. It was called bland. But it once meant warmth, rest, and survival. Cornmeal mush and milk deserve remembrance because they reflect discipline over indulgence. They fed people who had little, asked for less, and endured quietly. This bowl held nourishment, routine, and resolve. It was eaten without complaint, trusted completely, and relied upon night after night, until endurance became habit, and habit became survival, carried forward by necessity, memory, and the steady rhythm of stirring cornmeal into boiling water, again and again, until hunger loosened, morning came, and another day could begin without fear, complaint, or expectation of comfort, luxury, or relief beyond fullness, strength, and survival. It remained a quiet proof that simplicity could carry people through hardship when nothing else would endure again alone. Poke sallet. Poke sallet was a supper born from hunger, knowledge, and risk. In the Appalachian hills, families turned to wild pokeweed when gardens failed and stores were out of reach. This plant could kill if handled carelessly. Leaves had to be gathered young, boiled, drained, and boiled again, sometimes 3 times, before they were safe. That knowledge was learned early and taught without error. Once prepared, poke sallet was fried in bacon grease with onions or scrambled with eggs. It tasted strong, bitter, and unmistakably green. No one mistook it for comfort food. This supper mattered because it proved survival depended on knowledge, not money. Anyone could walk past pokeweed. Only those taught properly could eat it. As supermarkets expanded, poke sallet disappeared. It was called dangerous. It was dismissed as desperation. What vanished with it was the discipline behind the meal. Remembering poke sallet matters because it represents trust in elders, respect for land, and responsibility passed hand to hand. This supper was never casual. It demanded attention, restraint, and precision. It fed families when options vanished, using nothing but what the hills provided. That truth deserves memory, not novelty, because survival once depended on getting it right every single time, without shortcuts, excuses, or second chances in kitchens where mistakes meant sickness, hunger, or worse, and where knowledge was the difference between eating supper and going without, season after season, year after year, until memory itself became protection, preserved through careful teaching, repetition, and respect, ensuring that survival remained possible even when nothing else could be trusted in the mountains where food choices were never simple, never safe, and never taken lightly, especially during the hardest years of hunger, scarcity, uncertainty, and survival for families who depended on memory more than recipes to stay alive. Sawmill gravy and biscuits. Sawmill gravy and biscuits were a working supper made for exhaustion. In Appalachian homes, this meal ended days spent cutting timber, hauling coal, or clearing land. It was hot, fast, and heavy enough to quiet hunger. The gravy began with bacon drippings saved carefully in a tin. Flour was stirred in until thick, then milk followed, stretched when needed with water. Black pepper mattered. Meat did not. When scraps existed, they were added. When they did not, the gravy still came together. Biscuits were mixed by hand, baked close together, and broken open while steaming. Gravy was poured without measuring. No plate stayed clean. This supper mattered because it turned leftovers into strength. Nothing new was required. It rewarded thrift and attention, not abundance. Children learned early that grease was not waste. It was currency. Sawmill gravy earned its name because it fueled labor. It settled deep and stayed there. After eating, people slept hard, then rose early, ready to work again. As packaged mixes replaced scratch cooking, this meal faded. It was judged unhealthy. It was dismissed as heavy. What disappeared was understanding of why it existed. Remembering sawmill gravy and biscuits matters because it explains how people matched food to labor. This supper fed muscles, not trends. It respected effort and time. It filled stomachs when money was gone and tomorrow demanded strength. It was not elegant. It was dependable. In kitchens where survival ruled, this meal delivered exactly what was required, nothing more, nothing less, night after night, until work was done, bodies endured, and another day could begin without question, apology, or excess. It reflects a time when supper answered hunger directly, honored effort, and kept families moving forward through seasons that offered little mercy, working households across the mountains. Leather breeches and beans. Leather breeches and beans came from summers spent planning for winter. In Appalachian homes, green beans were strung on thread and hung from rafters to dry. By winter, they were tough, dark, and concentrated with flavor. When cooked, the beans were soaked, then simmered for hours with water, salt, and sometimes a scrap of pork. The smell meant supper was coming, even when cupboards were nearly empty. This meal mattered because it turned abundance into insurance. Fresh beans did not last. Drying them meant survival months later, when gardens slept and money was gone. Leather breeches taught foresight. Families worked ahead, trusting time and patience. Every string of beans represented a promise kept. The supper was plain but filling. Beans were served in bowls with their broth. Cornbread followed. Nothing else was required. As freezers and canned goods arrived, leather britches disappeared. Drying food at home was called unnecessary. What was lost was the habit of preparing for scarcity before it arrived. Remembering leather britches and beans matters because it shows how people planned hunger out of their future. This was not desperation cooking. It was discipline. This supper rewarded work done months earlier. It fed families through snow, isolation, and long winters. It asked for memory, not money. In the hills, survival often depended on what had been prepared long before hunger appeared. Leather britches and beans were proof that foresight could be eaten, shared, and trusted night after night, until spring returned and the cycle began again. They stood as quiet evidence that preparation was not fear, but care, passed between generations, shaping kitchens where survival was planned calmly, steadily, and without drama, long before hardship demanded answers. This practice turned time into protection when nothing else could be trusted at all. Fried cornbread and buttermilk. Fried cornbread and buttermilk were a supper built for nights when the pantry was nearly empty. In Appalachian homes, this meal relied on what almost everyone still had when money was gone. Cornmeal was mixed with water or leftover milk, shaped by hand, and dropped into hot grease. The cakes cooked fast, forming a crisp crust that sealed in warmth and strength. There was no leavening, no sweetness, and no waste. Buttermilk was poured cold into cups or bowls. It was not a drink for pleasure. It was nourishment, tangy and filling, taken seriously. Together, the hot bread and cold milk balanced hunger and fatigue. This supper mattered because it could be made at any hour. It required no oven and no planning. When a day ran long or supplies ran thin, this meal answered immediately. Children learned early how to judge heat by sound, how to flip without breaking, and how to pull bread before it burned. Mistakes were eaten anyway. Nothing was discarded. Fried cornbread and buttermilk were eaten quietly. Plates were optional. Hands worked fast. Hunger decided portions. As modern bread replaced scratch cooking, this supper faded. It was dismissed as outdated. What disappeared was its purpose. Remembering this meal matters because it reflects speed, practicality, and trust in basics. It fed people without ceremony or excess. It asked for attention, not money. This supper filled stomachs when nothing else could. It carried families through lean evenings and early mornings. In homes shaped by necessity, fried cornbread and buttermilk were not fallback food. They were a reliable answer, used again and again, trusted without hesitation, proving that simplicity could still deliver strength, warmth, and survival when options vanished and hunger needed a response that worked every single time without apology. Chow and salt pork. Chow and salt pork were a supper built from preservation. In Appalachian households, families relied on what they could pickle, smoke, or salt to survive winter months. Chow, a mix of chopped vegetables like cabbage, beans, and peppers, was pickled in jars and stored for months. Salt pork was cured fatback, sliced thin, and saved for days when fresh meat was scarce. When supper time came, salt pork was fried slowly until it released fat into the skillet. Chow was added, warmed just enough to release its tangy flavor, and served with cornbread or potatoes. The meal was simple, sharp, and sustaining. Nothing was wasted. Every scrap of pork fat, every vegetable mattered. This supper mattered because it embodied planning and resourcefulness. Families knew that spring gardens would not feed them through winter. Pickling, curing, and preserving were not hobbies. They were survival skills. Chow and salt pork proved that even in scarcity, food could be flavorful, filling, and enduring. Children learned lessons about patience, careful storage, and appreciation for effort. They learned that survival was not luck. It was preparation and attention. As refrigeration and store-bought canned goods spread, this supper disappeared. It was called outdated, heavy, or inconvenient. What vanished was knowledge embedded in hands, in kitchens, and in jars lining pantries. Remembering chow and salt pork matters because it represents resilience in the face of scarcity. It reflects ingenuity, endurance, and the quiet dignity of creating meals that lasted. This supper fed families through the harshest months, proving that even the simplest preserved ingredients could provide comfort, strength, and sustenance when fresh food was nowhere to be found. In every tangy bite and crisped fat strip, there was a story of survival, memory, and mountains that demanded careful attention to both time and toil. Hoe cakes and molasses. Hoe cakes and molasses were a supper born from necessity and tradition. In Appalachian homes, this simple meal required little more than cornmeal, water, and a pan, with molasses added when available for sweetness. It was a quick, hot dish that could feed a family at the end of long days in fields, forests, or mines. Cornmeal was mixed with water into a thin batter, then fried on a hot griddle or skillet until crisp and golden. Molasses was drizzled over each hoe cake, sometimes thick, sometimes diluted with water to stretch its sweetness. The combination offered calories, warmth, and satisfaction that went far beyond its humble ingredients. This supper mattered because it was adaptable. Hoe cakes could be eaten plain, fried, or even crumbled into soups. Molasses provided a rare treat, a small luxury that brought comfort when sugar was scarce. Families relied on it during lean months, making the most of what was at hand. Hoe cakes and molasses also carried lessons. Children learned how to stir the batter without lumps, judge the heat of a skillet by smell and sizzle, and appreciate sweetness earned through effort. Nothing was wasted. Leftover hoe cakes were saved for breakfast or fried again for supper, proving that every meal mattered. As packaged breads, pancakes, and syrups arrived, this meal disappeared from daily life. It was called old-fashioned, too plain, or poor. But what vanished was knowledge, ingenuity, and the quiet rhythm of hands and griddles that sustained families through scarcity. Remembering hoe cakes and molasses matters because it demonstrates how simplicity, attention, and resourcefulness can feed more than just the body. It nourished endurance, resilience, and connection to place. This supper is proof that sustenance does not require abundance, only care, memory, and the willingness to turn the simplest ingredients into meals that kept families alive, full, and moving forward, night after night, through winters and hardships that demanded trust in tradition above all else.